The sun was burning hot over Henderson Field that Saturday afternoon, and thousands of people had come to watch the annual military air show. Families were sitting on blankets spread across the grass, and children were running around with tiny flags in their hands, while vendors were busy selling hot dogs and cold drinks to everyone. The day was special because the main event was going to be a flying demonstration by the famous A-10 Thunderbolt II, which everyone called the Warthog. Margaret Walsh was sitting in her old folding chair near the flight line, and her weathered hands were resting on top of a wooden cane. She was 83 years old, and she looked different from everyone else because she was wearing a vintage leather flight jacket that had become soft after so many decades of use. The jacket had faded patches on it that most people would not recognize. Her silver hair was pinned up neatly under a blue cap, and even though the weather was very hot, she seemed perfectly comfortable sitting there in her spot. Behind her, there was a group of young men in their 20s who had brought coolers full of beer, and they were talking very loudly about military aircraft. They were wearing expensive sunglasses and designer shirts, and it was clear they cared more about drinking and having fun than actually watching the planes. One of them looked at Margaret and started laughing. He said to his friends that there was an old lady sitting up front who looked like she got lost on her way to bingo night. His friends thought this was very funny, and they all laughed together. Another one said that she was probably someone's grandmother, who was in the wrong place and would complain about the noise. Margaret heard everything they said, but she did not turn around to look at them. She had heard much worse things in her lifetime, and she knew how to ignore people like that. Instead, she adjusted her cap and kept looking at the runway where the ground crew members were doing their final checks on the big gray aircraft. The announcer's voice came through the speakers and told everyone to look at the runway. He said they were honored to have Captain Derek Manning flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II, and that Captain Manning had more than 2,000 flight hours in the Warthog and had served 3 combat tours overseas. Everyone started clapping as the sound of the A-10's twin engines began to get louder. The aircraft looked both ugly and beautiful at the same time as it started moving toward the runway. Its nose looked like it was drooping down a little, which made it look dangerous, and the massive cannon that stuck out from underneath looked like a huge tusk. Margaret watched the plane and whispered to herself that it was a real plane. She had a small smile on her face. The young men behind her were getting louder as they drank more beer. One of them called out to Margaret and told her she might want to cover her ears because jets get very loud, and he would not want her to damage her hearing aid. All his friends burst out laughing again. A woman who was with them added that maybe someone should help the old lady back to the nursing home before the show started, because this was not really appropriate for elderly people. Some families sitting nearby looked annoyed at the group, but nobody said anything to them. Margaret stayed completely still, and her face did not show any emotion behind her sunglasses. Her fingers got a little tighter on her cane, but that was the only sign that she had heard them. The A-10's engines roared very loud, and the aircraft started moving faster down the runway. Even though it looked clumsy on the ground, the Warthog lifted into the air smoothly. Captain Manning immediately turned the aircraft sharply and gave everyone a perfect view of the distinctive twin-tail design. As Margaret watched the aircraft climb higher, her mind went back many years to another airfield, and another time when she was the one sitting in the cockpit. She remembered the faces of the other pilots she had flown with, and all the young men and women who had fought hard to prove that flying skill was more important than whether you were male or female. The A-10 screamed overhead at very low altitude, and the whole crowd gasped. Captain Manning did a perfect barrel roll, and the aircraft moved through the air in ways that seemed impossible for something so big and heavy. Margaret whispered that this was real flying, and her eyes followed every single movement the plane made. Behind her, one of the young men stood up, and he was swaying because he had drunk too much beer. He tapped Margaret on the shoulder and asked her why she did not tell them what she thought she knew about planes. He said he bet she had never even been in one of these things. Margaret slowly turned her head and looked up at him with calm, steady eyes. She told him he should sit down because the show was about to get interesting. The man's friends laughed even harder at this. One of them said that she was giving advice now and asked if she was some kind of expert. Margaret turned back to watch the plane and did not say anything else. She knew that sometimes the best response was no response at all. The A-10 was coming around for another pass, and she did not want to miss a single moment of watching it fly. The young men kept laughing and making jokes, but Margaret had already forgotten about them because her attention was completely focused on the beautiful sight of the Warthog cutting through the sky above her. Captain Derek Manning pushed the A-10 through another low pass, and the distinctive sound of the engines created that famous growl that made the Warthog so recognizable. From where he sat in the cockpit, he could see everything below him perfectly, and something caught his attention that made him look more carefully. As he pulled the aircraft up and circled back around, he noticed that there was some kind of problem happening in the seating area near the flight line. Even from up in the air, he could see a small group of people clustered around someone who was sitting in a chair, and the way they were standing and moving made it look like there was a confrontation happening, rather than people just enjoying the show. He pressed the button on his radio and spoke to the tower. He told them he was seeing some kind of disturbance in Sector 3 of the viewing area and asked if they could get security to check it out. The controller in the tower responded right away and said they were sending security personnel now, and told him to continue with his demonstration. But as Derek flew the plane through another turn and went lower for his next pass, he got a much clearer view of what was happening down there. An elderly woman wearing what looked like an old flight jacket was being bothered by a group of younger people. Something about seeing this scene really bothered him deep inside. The A-10 was designed to be a close air support aircraft, which meant its job was to protect troops on the ground, and the most important rule was to never leave anyone behind. Derek thought about this and made a decision that he knew would break every rule in the demonstration handbook. He radioed the tower again and told them he was breaking pattern because he needed to make an unscheduled low approach over Sector 3. There was a pause, and then the controller asked if there was an emergency. Derek said affirmative and told them he was continuing his approach. He brought the A-10 down to less than 500 feet and pulled back on the throttle to let the aircraft slow down until it was just barely above stall speed. He came in directly over the crowd in Sector 3, and the shadow of the Warthog passed over all of them. Then, instead of pulling up for the next maneuver like he was supposed to do, he did something that had never been done before. He brought the A-10 around in a circle and entered a slow orbit directly over the viewing area, with the nose of the aircraft pointed down at a steep angle, which gave him a perfect view of the situation below. The crowd became completely silent because they were confused about why he was not following the planned show. Through the camera on his targeting pod, Derek zoomed in on the elderly woman, and that was when he saw the patches on her jacket very clearly for the first time. His breath caught in his throat, and he could not believe what he was seeing. He radioed the tower immediately and said he needed to land right away. He said this was not a drill, but it was not an emergency either, and that he would explain everything once he was on the ground. The controller said he was breaking protocol and they needed him to explain, but Derek interrupted and said he was landing and would take full responsibility for his actions. The confusion in the crowd turned into amazement as everyone watched the A-10 break from its orbit and line up for an immediate landing. Nothing like this had ever happened in the entire history of the air show, and people were talking to each other trying to figure out what was going on. As the aircraft touched down on the runway and started taxiing toward the viewing area, the security personnel finally reached the spot where Margaret was sitting. The young men who had been making fun of her suddenly found themselves surrounded by serious-looking military police officers and event security guards. One of the military police sergeants had a stern look on his face, and his hand was resting on his belt. He asked what the problem was, and one of the young men tried to laugh about it and said there was no problem, and they were just having some fun with the old lady, and no harm was done. Margaret spoke quietly and said that the old lady had a name and she did not recall asking for their entertainment. The military policeman was about to say something, but everyone's attention suddenly shifted because the A-10 had come to a complete stop less than 100 yards away from where they were standing. The engines began winding down, and the canopy started to open. Captain Derek Manning climbed down from the cockpit very quickly, and he did not even wait for the ground crew to put the ladder in position properly. He walked across the tarmac toward the viewing area, and his flight suit still had various hoses and connections attached that he pulled off as he walked. The crowd moved apart to let him through, and everyone was confused and excited at the same time about what was happening. Derek walked straight past the security personnel and the group of troublemakers, without even looking at them. He stopped, directly in front of Margaret, and removed his helmet and sunglasses. His eyes were fixed on the patches that were sewn onto her jacket. There was a very long moment when nobody said anything, and the silence felt heavy. Then Captain Derek Manning, who was a combat veteran and one of the Air Force's top A-10 pilots, stood up very straight, and gave the sharpest salute of his entire career. He said that he was addressing Colonel Margaret Walsh and introduced himself as Captain Derek Manning from the 104th Fighter Squadron. He said it was an honor to meet her. The silence that fell over the viewing area was so complete that people could hear their own hearts beating. Every single eye was looking at the elderly woman sitting in the folding chair and the pilot who was standing at attention in front of her. Margaret slowly got to her feet using her cane for support, and a smile spread across her weathered face as she returned the salute with surprising crispness. She told the captain to be at ease and said she had been retired for 30 years, so there was no need for such formality. Derek lowered his salute, but he remained standing at attention. He said with respect that there was every need for formality. He told her he knew who she was and that he had studied her service record when he was at the academy. He said she had flown F-4 Phantoms in Vietnam and that she was one of the first women to qualify for combat aircraft. He said she had a Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 Silver Stars. A sound like a wave rippled through the crowd as people whispered to each other about what they were hearing. The young men who had been mocking Margaret just moments before suddenly looked like they wanted to disappear into the ground. Margaret chuckled softly and said, "That was a very long time ago, and it was a different Air Force and a different world back then." Derek continued and asked if her call sign had been Duchess. He said it was because she flew with such precision that troops on the ground said she could put bombs through a Duchess's window without disturbing her tea. The event organizer, who was a retired Air Force colonel, named Paul Henderson, came rushing over with a microphone because he quickly understood that something extraordinary was happening. Right in front of everyone, he asked Margaret for permission and then handed the microphone to Captain Manning. Derek turned to speak to the crowd and his voice was steady and full of respect. He told everyone that he needed to explain why he had broken protocol and landed his aircraft. He said the woman they were looking at was Colonel Margaret Walsh, who was retired, and she was not just any veteran but a true legend. He turned back to Margaret and asked if she would mind if he shared some of her story with everyone. He said he thought these people needed to hear it. Margaret hesitated for a moment and then nodded slowly. She said if he must do it, then go ahead. But she imagined most people were more interested in seeing him fly than hearing an old woman's war stories. Derek said with respect that they were wrong about that. He faced the crowd again and his voice grew even stronger. He said that in 1969, Colonel Walsh was one of fewer than 20 women in the entire United States Air Force who had pilot ratings. He said she had fought for years just to get into flight school and faced discrimination and mockery at every single turn. He looked pointedly at the young men who were standing behind Margaret's chair, and they were now trying to move away through the crowd, but the military police blocked their path. Derek continued with the story and said she had been assigned to support roles and transport missions because the Air Force wanted to keep her away from combat. But when the Air Force needed experienced pilots in Vietnam, they could not afford to be picky anymore. He said Colonel Walsh flew 73 combat missions in the F-4 Phantom, and those were missions over some of the most heavily defended airspace in the entire world. The crowd was completely silent now and everyone was listening to every single word. Derek kept talking and said that on her 43rd mission, her aircraft took heavy fire from anti-aircraft guns on the ground. Her weapons system officer was wounded badly, and her hydraulics were failing, but she had been providing close air support for a Marine unit that was pinned down by enemy forces. Instead of turning around and heading back to safety, she made 3 more attack runs even though her aircraft was badly damaged. She gave those Marines the cover they needed so they could retreat to safety. Derek's voice became thick with emotion as he continued. He said that 12 Marines owed their lives to her actions that day. He said she barely made it back to the base and the aircraft was so badly damaged that it never flew again. She was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for that action. Margaret's eyes had become distant as if she was remembering that day and everything that had happened. She said quietly that they did not leave their people behind. She said that was the rule back then and it was still the rule now. A woman in the crowd called out and asked what happened after Vietnam. Derek smiled and said that Colonel Walsh continued to serve her country. He said she flew F-15 Eagles when they were brand new aircraft. He said she trained 2 entire generations of fighter pilots. He said she broke down barriers so that women like Major Lisa Curtis, who flew combat missions in Operation Desert Storm, could serve without anyone questioning whether they belonged there. He said she retired as a full colonel in 1995, but her legacy continues in every single female pilot who wears the uniform today. The crowd erupted in applause that was so loud it echoed across the entire field. But Derek held up his hand to quiet them down because he was not finished yet. He turned to the security personnel and pointed at the group of young men who had been harassing Margaret. He said these individuals had been mocking the colonel when he observed them from the air, and that was why he had broken pattern. He said he could not continue a demonstration celebrating Air Force excellence, while a genuine Air Force hero was being disrespected right there in front of everyone. Derek thanked Margaret for her service and for her sacrifice and for making it possible for all of them to serve today. Margaret stood up from her chair and there were tears in her eyes now. She embraced the young captain and thanked him in return. She thanked him for remembering and for caring and for flying that beautiful machine the way she deserved to be flown. The crowd watched this moment between the old pilot and the young pilot, and many people were wiping tears from their own eyes because they understood they had witnessed something truly special. As the sun began to set over Henderson Field that evening, Margaret Walsh departed quietly just as she had arrived. She did not want any more fuss or attention. She just wanted to go home and rest because it had been a very long and emotional day. But word of what had happened spread quickly through military circles and then beyond into the civilian world. Within just a few days, her story was being featured in military publications and civilian news outlets. Young people who had never heard of the early female combat pilots were learning about the barriers that had been broken decades ago. Social media was full of the video that spectators had recorded on their phones. The moment when Derek had saluted her, and the moment when she had sat in the cockpit were being shared millions of times. Margaret returned home to her quiet life in her small house, but her phone started ringing constantly with requests for interviews and speaking engagements. News programs wanted her to come on television. Magazines wanted to write feature stories about her. Schools wanted her to come speak to students. At first she was overwhelmed by all the attention, but then she started accepting some of the requests. She was always careful to note that she had been just one of many pioneers. She said there were other women who had fought the same battles and faced the same discrimination. She said the real victory was that young women today did not have to fight those same battles that she had fought. Captain Derek Manning received a formal reprimand for breaking demonstration protocol, which he accepted without any complaint at all. His commander called him into the office and told him that the reprimand was merely a formality that had to be done because rules had been broken. But the commander made it very clear that Derek's actions had brought great honor to the Air Force. He said that showing respect for the service's heritage and its heroes was more important than following a flight demonstration plan. The letter of reprimand was placed in Derek's official file, along with a letter of commendation for exceptional judgment and respect for Air Force heritage. The commendation would carry far more weight in his career than the reprimand ever would. The video of the encounter that had been captured by dozens of spectators on their phones went viral online. It was viewed tens of millions of times in just the first week. It became required viewing at Air Force Academy courses on leadership and military heritage. Instructors used it to teach cadets about what service meant beyond just flying planes and fighting battles. It was shown to new recruits as an example of the values that the Air Force held dear. Respect for those who came before, recognition of sacrifice, the understanding that every generation stands on the shoulders of the previous generation. And somewhere in America at air shows all across the country something changed. Every time an air show featured the distinctive growl of the A-10 Warthog people, thought of the elderly woman in the vintage flight jacket. Before the demonstrations began, announcers started taking a moment to talk about the history of military aviation and the pioneers who had broken barriers. They talked about people like Colonel Margaret Walsh, who had proven that true valor never ages, and that respect is always deserved and always earned and always worth defending. The story spread beyond just military circles. It became a cultural moment that made people think about how they treat elderly people in general. Nursing homes reported that families were visiting more often. Young people were being more respectful to older people in public spaces. It was as if the entire country had been reminded that every elderly person has a story, and every story matters. Some of those stories might be heroic like Margaret's, and some might be ordinary, but all of them deserve respect and dignity. Margaret continued to receive letters from young people all over the country. Girls wrote to tell her that they wanted to be pilots now because of her. Boys wrote to say they had apologized to their grandparents for being disrespectful. Parents wrote to say they were teaching their children about the importance of honoring those who came before them. Each letter touched Margaret's heart, and she tried to respond to as many as she could. She wrote back in her neat handwriting and told them to pursue their dreams, and to always treat others with kindness and respect, regardless of their age or appearance. The young men who had mocked her that day also reached out. They sent her a letter together expressing their deep shame and apologizing again for their behavior. They said they had all quit drinking and were volunteering at veterans organizations to try to make amends. They said meeting her and being confronted with their own cruelty had changed their lives. Margaret wrote back to them and said she forgave them and hoped they would use this experience to become better men. She said everyone deserves a second chance, and she believed they would not waste theirs. In the years that followed the airshow incident, Margaret became something of a celebrity, though she never quite got comfortable with that role. She accepted speaking engagements at universities and military bases and high schools. She appeared in a documentary about women in military aviation that won several awards. She wrote a memoir with the help of a professional writer, and the book became a bestseller. The royalties from the book were more money than she had ever expected to see, and she donated most of it to scholarships for young women who wanted to pursue careers in aviation or military service. Margaret stayed in touch with Captain Derek Manning, and they became close friends despite the difference in their ages. Derek would call her regularly to talk about flying and life, and sometimes just to check in and make sure she was doing well. He told her that meeting her had changed his perspective on what it meant to be a military officer. He said he understood now that wearing the uniform carried responsibilities beyond just doing your job well. He said it meant honoring those who came before and setting an example for those who would come after. Derek was promoted to major and then to lieutenant colonel. Each time he received a promotion, he called Margaret to tell her the news and to thank her for inspiring him. He said that when he faced difficult decisions as a commander, he often thought about what she would do, and that helped guide him. Margaret was touched by this and told him she was proud of the officer he had become. The air show at Henderson Field became an annual pilgrimage for Margaret. Every year she would return to watch the demonstrations, and every year the organizers would give her a place of honor in the VIP section. Young pilots would seek her out to introduce themselves and thank her for her service. Families would bring their daughters to meet her, and Margaret would encourage the girls to dream big and never let anyone tell them what they could not do. The air show became a celebration not just of aviation, but of the progress that had been made toward equality and the work that still remained to be done. One year, a group of female pilots organized a special flyover in Margaret's honor. They flew 6 different aircraft representing different eras of military aviation, including an F-4 Phantom, painted in the same colors as the one Margaret had flown in Vietnam. They performed a missing man formation where one aircraft pulled up and away from the group, symbolizing fallen comrades. As Margaret watched from the ground with tears streaming down her face, she thought about all the people she had known who were no longer here. She thought about the friends who had died and the barriers they had helped break and the legacy they had left behind. Margaret lived to see more changes than she had ever imagined possible. She saw women become fighter squadron commanders and wing commanders. She saw a woman become a general officer in the Air Force. She saw women flying every type of aircraft in the inventory, from cargo planes to bombers to fighters to the most advanced stealth aircraft. She saw women graduate at the top of their classes at the Air Force Academy and win the highest awards for valor in combat. Each milestone filled her with pride and reminded her that the struggle had been worth it. On her 90th birthday, Margaret received a phone call from the White House. The president wanted to award her the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor in the United States. Margaret was stunned and overwhelmed. She tried to decline, saying there were others more deserving, but her family and friends insisted she accept. So she made another trip to Washington and stood in the East Room of the White House, while the president placed the medal around her neck and praised her for her courage and her service and her lifelong dedication to breaking down barriers. Margaret gave a short speech at the ceremony and once again emphasized that she had not done this alone. She said she was accepting the medal on behalf of all the women who had fought for the right to serve, and all the women who continued that fight today in different ways. She said the battle for equality was not over and might never be completely over, but each generation moved it forward a little more. She said she was grateful to have played a small part in that long march toward justice. As Margaret entered her final years, she began to slow down physically, but her mind remained sharp and her spirit remained strong. She still attended the air show every year, though. Now she needed a wheelchair to get around. Young pilots would push her wheelchair and walk beside her and listen to her stories. She would point at aircraft and explain their capabilities and their history. She would talk about what it felt like to fly, and about the bonds that form between people who trust each other with their lives. One warm spring afternoon, Margaret was sitting in her garden at home when she received an unexpected visitor. It was Lieutenant Amy Parker who had met her at the air show years before. Amy was now a captain and an instructor pilot. She had come to tell Margaret that she was expecting her first child and it was going to be a girl. She said she wanted to name the baby Margaret if that was all right. Margaret was deeply moved and said it would be an honor. She told Amy to teach her daughter to be strong and brave and kind. She told her to teach the girl that she could be anything she wanted to be, and should never let anyone else's limitations define her possibilities. Margaret Walsh passed away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 94. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Representatives from every branch of the military attended. The current Chief of Staff of the Air Force gave the eulogy. 4 F-35 Lightning jets flown by female pilots performed a flyover. Derek Manning, who was now a colonel, served as one of the pallbearers. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects to a woman who had changed the world in quiet but profound ways. After the funeral, people gathered to share stories about Margaret. They talked about her kindness and her humility, and her unwavering dedication to excellence. They talked about how she had never sought glory, but had simply done her duty to the best of her ability. They talked about how she had opened doors for others while always insisting that individual merit was what mattered most. They agreed that the world was better because Margaret Walsh had been in it, and that her legacy would continue for generations. Years later, young women joining the Air Force would learn about Colonel Margaret Walsh in their history classes. They would see her photograph on the walls of squadron ready rooms. They would hear stories about her courage and her skill and her determination. Some would visit her grave at Arlington and leave flowers or small tokens of respect. Some would name their daughters after her. All would benefit from the path she had helped clear and the example she had set. And every time an A-10 Warthog thundered across the sky, someone somewhere would remember the day when a young captain had stopped his demonstration to honor an elderly woman in a folding chair, and in doing so had reminded everyone that heroes walk among us and deserve our respect and our gratitude always. As the displays came to life in front of her, Margaret's trained eye took in all the information that appeared on the screens. The avionics were modern and far beyond anything she had worked with during her flying days, but the fundamental logic behind everything was familiar to her. She reached out and touched the controls for the head-up display, and a smile crossed her face. She called down to Derek and said that when she was flying, they navigated by using paper maps and dead reckoning. She said what she was seeing now was absolutely incredible. Derek said yes, it was incredible technology, but he told her they could not do any of it without pioneers like her, who proved that women could handle combat aircraft just as well as men. He said she had paved the runway that all of them fly on today. Margaret was quiet for a moment, and her hands were resting on the control stick. She said she had never thought about it like that before. She said she just wanted to fly and she just wanted to serve her country. Derek told her that was exactly what made her a hero. He said she did not do it for glory or recognition. She did it because it was the right thing to do. After several minutes sitting in the cockpit, Margaret reluctantly decided it was time to climb down. Derek helped her carefully, and as her feet touched the ground, she found herself surrounded not just by the original crowd but by dozens of Air Force personnel who had come from other parts of the air show. When word spread about who was present, among them were several female pilots wearing flight suits, and all of them were looking at Margaret with undisguised awe and admiration. A young woman who was barely 30 years old stepped forward from the group. She wore the wings of an A-10 pilot on her uniform. She said her name was Lieutenant Amy Parker, and she flew Warthogs out of Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. She said she just wanted to say thank you to Colonel Walsh. She said her grandmother used to tell her that girls could not be fighter pilots, and if it was not for women, like Margaret, her grandmother might have been right. Margaret took the young woman's hand in hers and held it firmly. She told Lieutenant Parker to fly well, and to remember that every time she strapped into that aircraft, she was not just defending her country. She said she was also proving that excellence has no gender and never did. Other pilots came forward after that, and each one wanted just a moment with the legendary colonel. They were male and female and young and old, and all of them understood they were in the presence of someone who had changed their profession forever. They asked questions and shared their own stories and thanked her for making it possible for them to serve. Margaret listened to each one and spoke with them and gave them encouragement. She seemed genuinely surprised that so many people knew about her and cared about what she had done so many years ago. Finally, Derek stepped forward again and said he had one more request if she would permit him. Margaret asked what it was. Derek said he would like to complete his demonstration that had been interrupted. He said he wanted to dedicate the demonstration to her. He said if she was willing, he would like her to watch from the VIP area where she should have been sitting all along. Margaret smiled and said her chair had been just fine and she was comfortable there. But she said if it would make him feel better, she would move to the VIP section for the rest of the show. As event staff quickly arranged a very comfortable seat for her in the shaded VIP area, Derek returned to his aircraft. The ground crew helped him get strapped back in and ran through all the checks again to make sure everything was ready. This time, when he took off, the entire crowd was watching with a new appreciation and understanding of what they were seeing. They understood more deeply now what military service meant and what sacrifices people had made so they could sit here safely and watch planes fly. Derek put the A-10 through its paces with renewed energy and purpose. Every single maneuver was dedicated to the woman watching from below. He demonstrated the aircraft's unique ability to fly slowly and deliberately, which showed how it could loiter over a battlefield and stay there for a long time, protecting troops on the ground. He showed its toughness and explained over the loudspeaker system how the aircraft could survive direct hits from enemy fire and still bring its pilot home safely. The titanium bathtub that surrounded the cockpit was designed to protect the pilot from ground fire, and the redundant systems meant the plane could keep flying even if major components were damaged. He flew low passes that made the ground shake and high loops that took him up into the clouds before diving back down. He showed off the Warthog's incredible gun run capability, where the massive cannon could fire 70 rounds per second. The sound of the gun, even when it was not actually firing, was distinctive and powerful. He explained that this was the plane that ground troops loved most because when they were in trouble and called for help, the A-10 would come and it would stay until the job was done. And then as he performed a final, thunderous low pass over the field, Derek waggled the Warthog's wings back and forth in a traditional salute to Colonel Margaret Walsh. The crowd understood what they were seeing and erupted in cheers. When he landed and climbed out of the cockpit for the second time that day, the crowd gave him the loudest ovation of the entire air show. People were standing and clapping and cheering. But Derek did not stop to acknowledge them. He immediately walked back to where Margaret was sitting in the VIP area and offered her his hand. Several months after the air show, Margaret received an invitation that surprised her more than anything else that had happened. The Air Force Chief of Staff wanted her to attend a special ceremony at the Pentagon. They wanted to honor her and several other pioneering female military aviators for their service and their contributions to breaking down barriers. At first, Margaret was reluctant to go because she had never liked being the center of attention. But her friends and family convinced her that this was important, not just for her but for all the women who would come after her. So Margaret made the trip to Washington and found herself standing in a room full of generals and senior officials and other female pilots from different eras. There were women who had flown in World War II as part of the Women Air Force Service Pilots program, even though they were not allowed to be official military members at the time. There were women who had flown helicopters in Vietnam. There were women who had been among the first to fly combat missions in the Gulf War and in Afghanistan and Iraq. Each one had a story of breaking barriers and facing discrimination and proving that women belonged in military aviation. The ceremony was moving and powerful. The Chief of Staff spoke about how these women had not just opened doors for other women, but had made the entire Air Force better and stronger. He said that by insisting on being judged by their skills and their performance rather than their gender, they had forced the military to focus on what really mattered, which was capability and competence. He said the Air Force was better today because of their courage and their refusal to accept limitations that had no basis in reality. When it was Margaret's turn to speak, she walked slowly to the podium and looked out at the audience. She saw young female pilots in their dress uniforms sitting in the front rows with expressions of admiration on their faces. She saw male pilots who understood that these women were their sisters in arms and their equals in every way. She saw civilians who worked for the Department of Defense and members of Congress who had come to witness this recognition. She took a deep breath and began to speak. She said that when she was young, she had simply wanted to fly. She said she had not set out to be a pioneer or a barrier breaker or any kind of hero. She said she just loved flying and wanted to serve her country and could not understand why being female should disqualify her from doing either of those things. She said the military had eventually given her a chance, and she had tried her best to prove she was worthy of that chance. She said she was just one person, and there had been many others who had fought the same fight, and some of them had not lived to see the changes that eventually came. Margaret talked about the women who had come before her and the women who had served alongside her. She named names and told stories about friends who had died in training accidents or in combat. She said every single one of them deserved to be remembered and honored. She said she was standing at this podium representing all of them, not just herself. Her voice broke with emotion as she spoke about a friend named Lieutenant Patricia Hughes, who had been killed in a helicopter crash in 1973 and never got to see women being fully accepted in military aviation. Then Margaret looked directly at the young female pilots in the audience. She told them they had inherited something precious, which was the right to serve without question, and without having to prove themselves any more than their male counterparts had to prove themselves. She said this right had been paid for with the blood and tears and determination of generations of women who had refused to give up. She told them to honor that legacy by being the best pilots and officers they could be. She told them to never take for granted what they had been given, and to always remember who had fought to give it to them. When Margaret finished speaking, the entire room stood and applauded for several minutes. Officers who normally maintained strict military bearing were wiping tears from their eyes. The chief of staff came over and shook her hand and thanked her personally. Other honored guests embraced her and shared their own stories with her. It was a day that Margaret would remember for the rest of her life. After the ceremony, there was a reception, and Margaret found herself surrounded by young pilots who wanted to talk with her and ask her questions. One young woman who was training to fly F-35 Lightning jets asked Margaret if she had any advice. Margaret thought for a moment and then said that her advice was simple. She said to remember that being a good pilot is about more than just flying skills. She said it is about judgment and discipline and taking care of your fellow pilots. She said it is about understanding that you are part of something larger than yourself, and that your actions reflect on everyone who wears the uniform. She said if you focus on being excellent at your job and treating others with respect, then everything else will take care of itself. Another pilot asked Margaret if she ever regretted her decision to fight so hard to fly combat aircraft. Margaret shook her head firmly. She said she had never regretted it for even a single moment. She said flying had given her life purpose and meaning, and she had been privileged to serve alongside some of the finest people she had ever known. She said the discrimination and the mockery and the obstacles had been difficult, but they had made her stronger and more determined. She said she would do it all again without changing a thing. The lead military police officer nodded with a grim expression on his face. He said they had the situation under control, and the men would be escorted off the grounds immediately and banned from all future events. One of the young men finally found his voice, and his face was red with both shame and anger mixed together. He said loudly that they did not know who she was and asked how they were supposed to know she was some war hero. He said she just looked like some old lady sitting in a chair. Margaret turned slowly to face him, and her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a knife. She said she was indeed some old lady, but that was not the point at all. She said they did not mock her because they did not know her service record. She said they mocked her because she was old, and they thought that made her less worthy of respect, and that was the real problem here. Derek stepped forward and his voice was firm. He said that every elderly person they see could have a story just like the Colonel's story. He said they could be veterans or pioneers or heroes. He said, or they could just be regular people who deserve basic human dignity. He said either way they deserve better than mockery from young people who should know better. Another one of the young men, and this one had tears streaming down his face, now stepped forward from the group. He said he wanted to speak to Colonel Walsh directly. He said he was so sorry and deeply ashamed of himself. He said he had been drunk and stupid, but he knew that was no excuse for what he had done. He said what he did was completely inexcusable, and he knew that. Margaret studied him for a long moment with her sharp eyes. She said he was right that it was inexcusable behavior, but she said he was young, and young people make mistakes all the time. She said the real question was whether he would learn something from this mistake. The young man said he would learn from it, and he swore he would never treat another person like that again, as long as he lived. Margaret said then they were done here. She turned to the military police and told them to let the men go. She said they had learned their lesson and she did not think they would be repeating their behavior anytime soon. The security personnel looked reluctant to follow her request, but they respected her wishes because of who she was. As the group of young men departed with an escort taking them to the exit, they all looked back at Margaret with expressions of deep shame on their faces. The event organizer stepped forward again and said that they had no idea she was attending the show today. He said if they had known she was coming, they would have arranged a proper seat in the VIP section and given her proper recognition for her service. Margaret waved him off with her hand and said that was exactly why she had not told anyone she was coming. She said she came to watch the show, not to be the show herself. She said she just wanted to see the Warthog fly because it was a beautiful aircraft. Derek grinned widely and asked her if she would like to see it up close. Margaret's eyes lit up with an enthusiasm that made her look decades younger than her actual age. She said she thought he would never ask. Derek offered his arm to her and Margaret took it while leaving her cane with a nearby volunteer who promised to keep it safe. Together they walked toward the A-10 and the crowd kept applauding as they passed by. Families who had been sitting nearby came forward to shake Margaret's hand and thank her for her service to the country. When they reached the aircraft, Margaret ran her hand along the fuselage with obvious reverence and love. She said it was a tough bird and there was nothing pretty about it, but it got the job done every single time. Derek asked if it was just like the F-4 she had flown. Margaret said the F-4 was faster, but yes, the same principle applied. She said form follows function, and both aircraft were designed to protect people on the ground and both did their jobs magnificently well. Derek climbed up on the wing of the aircraft and extended his hand down to her. He said he knew this was highly irregular and against all the rules, but he wanted to know if she would like to sit in the cockpit just for a moment. Margaret's eyes went wide with surprise. She said she was 83 years old and had not sat in a cockpit in over 3 decades. She said she did not think it was a good idea. Derek said please and told her it would be his honor to have her sit in his aircraft. With Derek's help and the assistance of several ground crew members, who quickly appeared to help, Colonel Walsh climbed carefully into the A-10's cockpit. She settled into the seat, and her hands instinctively found the controls as if no time had passed at all. Her eyes scanned the instruments with the practiced ease of someone who had spent thousands and thousands of hours in similar cockpits, flying similar aircraft. The crowd below watched in complete reverent silence as the elderly woman wearing the vintage flight jacket sat in the modern war machine. Her face was transformed by pure joy and memory of all the times she had done this before. Margaret called down to Derek and said it was different from what she had flown back in her day, but the bones were the same, and the purpose was the same. Derek climbed up beside the cockpit and told her he was going to start the auxiliary power unit and bring up some of the displays if that was all right with her. He said he wanted her to see what the aircraft could do. Margaret said he was going to get in trouble for doing this. Derek just smiled and said it was worth it.